coming to the stage, who's going to talk about the 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments, is Kurt Kinder, member of Campaign for Liberty.
I got to follow that great speech by Jim. I'll do the best I can, but I want to remind everybody, Jim's going to be speaking at our wine festival in a couple weeks. So if you enjoyed what he's saying, go over and get some tickets. We also got Roscoe Bartlett going to speak as well. They're $35 a ticket. We got a special going. You buy 3 today, you get a 4th free. We're only selling 300 tickets, folks, so you got to get them now. Okay, enough of the sales pitch, but I'll talk a little bit about 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments. Now these are amendments, all of the amendments to the Bill of Rights are very important for our liberty. And I always say these are the 3 amendments I hope you never have to use. Because the 6th Amendment deals with your rights as an individual when you're accused of a crime by the government. Things like speedy trial, trial by jury, representation by a lawyer. The 7th Amendment deals with a trial by jury in a civil case. And in the 8th Amendment, what that does, it ensures the federal government does not impose excessive fines, excessive bail, or cruel and unusual punishments. Now, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence under the grievances section, he specifically mentioned all of these issues. Because at the time of the Revolution, the colonists had no legal rights. Now, it wasn't always like this. In fact, all the way back to the 12th century in England, they had trial by juries. And even as the colonies were formed here, all of the colonies set up their legal system to ensure that everybody had trial by juries. It was something that was part of the American lifestyle way back in the 1600s. But what happened, the reason the king eventually took them away goes all the way back to the end of the 80 Years' War in 1647. What happened is Europe was fighting for 8 decades, and while they were fighting, they had trade embargoes on one another. So each country had their own shipping policies, trade policies, and they didn't have to deal with any kind of free market capitalism. But once the war ended and the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, all of the embargoes that were created were destroyed. So all of a sudden they had free markets. And it turns out in the late 1600s that England's shipping ability and trading ability was far inferior to the Dutch and the Spanish. So the English shipping companies were losing a lot of money. And kind of like what you're experiencing today in our government, the English shipping companies went to the king and asked for protection. And of course, he obliged. In 1651, the king passed the navigation ordinances. And what this did is it banned all foreign ships from transporting goods to England or any of England's colonies. It also banned the colonies from dealing with anybody but England. They couldn't do any trade with any other countries or any other non-English colonies. So what this meant is that the colonies, as they were shipping out their tobacco and cotton and other goods, they had to use an English shipping company. Which also meant that the English government could easily tax all of our goods and services. Well, this really came to a boiling point in 1733 when the king passed the Molasses Act. What the Molasses Act is, it put a high tariff and taxation on all the sugar that was imported from the French West Indies to the colonies. What the English was trying to do was to get the colonists to buy the much more expensive sugar from the British West Indies. Now, as you can imagine, the Navigation Acts and the Molasses Act created a very vibrant black market in the colonies. It was very profitable to be a smuggler. And as you can also imagine, the king was not too happy having the colonists smuggle goods and avoid taxation. So any chance they got, the English government would prosecute colonists who were smuggling. But once it went to trial, when we still had trial by juries, well, the local folks, the other colonists, they'd absolve the accused for the crimes, because they figured it was completely unfair what the English government was doing to us. Because at the time, trial by jury was the only legal recourse we had against the king. We had no vote in Parliament. So basically, the king just gave away our right to a trial. In fact, they would take colonists and take them over to England to try them. So effectively, what they did is they limited our ability to have any say on the king's policies, except for a revolution. Now, the Eighth Amendment, that prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Now, there's a good story behind that, in that it actually started way back in 1685, when an Englishman named Titus Oates was prosecuted for several counts of perjury. Titus Oates had actually perjured himself by wrongly accusing a few folks of crimes. And these English folks were actually put to death because of the false testimony of Oates. So you can imagine, Oates deserved a pretty severe punishment. But what the English government did is they gave him life in prison, with stipulations that twice a year he was taken out and publicly pillared, and once a year he was tied to a horse carriage, dragged around town, and whipped.
That's cruel and unusual, Kirk.
You could say that. But what's interesting is they didn't put Oates to death because they were afraid that by doing so would prevent other people from testifying in a trial. But I guess a public pillorying and whipping doesn't really keep people away. So basically, when we were doing the Constitution, Patrick Henry and George Mason demanded that we put in a clause prohibiting cruel and unusual punishments. And since the passing of the Eighth Amendment, we've had several cases that have dealt with things like excessive bail, excessive fine, and cruel and unusual punishment. And it's really not as cut and dry as you might think. Through some legal precedent, there are some crimes that are absolutely prohibited and seen as cruel and unusual punishment. Drawing and quartering a person, public dissections, burning someone alive, and disemboweling have been ruled cruel and unusual, so you can't do that no matter what the person does. They've also ruled that executing a person who's mentally handicapped or minors under 18 is cruel and unusual. But then there are some things that they rule are not cruel and unusual, such as a firing squad. The other thing that they've ruled is not cruel and unusual is California's three-strike rule. And that is, even with minor offenses, once you have your third strike, you could be in prison for life. So there's a guy in California who basically is serving a 50-year life sentence because he stole about $150 worth of videotapes. Now, to me, that seems a little excessive, but I guess the Supreme Court figured that guy should have been smart enough to leave after his second strike, get out of California. So the 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments are extremely important to your liberty, but hopefully you'll never actually have to use them. Thank you.
Liberty! Freedom! Independence! Oh, I'm loving. Oh, wow. I just blew you away at that speaker. All right. Come on, Cindy.